this is the story of how Spanish Jewry ended. Last class, we looked at what I would say maybe are the first 300 years of the Spanish Jewish community, from about 900 to 1200. We looked at the golden ages, the famous golden age, right, that occurred under Islam in Andalusia. And then we spoke about another golden age that occurred under Christian rule in the 1100s along the borderlands between what was then Christian and Muslim Spain, right, during the Reconquista. And we saw how there were times that were quite positive and where there was great cultural sharing and learning and a flourishing of the community. And we also spoke about the difficult times that occurred during times of persecution and when Jews needed to flee, and the beginning of the Sephardi diaspora, right? Famously Rambam, right, calls himself Sephardi despite leaving in the 1100s and ending up in Egypt. And so that period that we looked at, those first 300 years, that's generally speaking what we think of kind of the heyday, as it were, of the Spanish Jewish community of Sfarad. What we're going to look at today in this class is the next 300 years, from 1200 to 1500. Now, it wasn't all doom and gloom, but you can certainly see a transition that occurs during these centuries where there are signs of growing difficulty within Jewish-Christian relations. And ultimately, of course, it concludes in 1492 with the Expulsion. Now, some terms that we're going to be using tonight, we're going to need to clarify their meaning, because a lot of times you hear about the Inquisition, you hear about the Expulsion, and sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. We're going to talk about what exactly those things are, when exactly they occurred, who they were directed at, because it actually was directed at two different populations, not the same group of Jews, as it were. And so this will really set the stage for our journey, right, through the story of the Western Sephardim. For the most part, the story of tonight, again, is a story that relates to a large proportion of Sephardi Jews. Of course, some Sephardi Jews had left already earlier, and throughout this period, you'll see Sephardi Jews who leave Spain and go to other places. And we'll see how this is going to ultimately relate in upcoming lectures, which is where you get into kind of the unique story of what we call the Western Sephardi Jews, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. So in a sense, this is still their backstory, right? This is still the backdrop for then understanding the unique circumstances that define the specifically Western Sephardi story, in contrast to other Sephardi diaspora communities that will end up either in North Africa or in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, as we shall see. So let's just begin by talking about one phenomenon that occurs in the 13th century as a way to just, shall we say, start to present a picture of a period of some growing tension, right, and hostility between communities, right? And that is the subject of disputations. So disputations is the word, right, that comes from the to dispute, right, that reflect the disputations, the public, shall we say, inquiries or hearings that take place that place Jews and Christians in not simply conversation, right, but in debate with one another as it relates to religious and theological topics, right? So these are public debates. The objective, which, of course, you're looking probably at Christian-dominated countries, right, having disputations with a minority, vulnerable Jewish community, right? And the objective of these debates is not simply, intellectual curiosity, the opportunity to share ideas and perspectives to further, intellectual knowledge, the pursuit, shall we say, of truth, right? The possibility that anybody could win and, the outcome could have any kind of ramification. Of course, the expectation by setting up these disputes is that, in the view of those who set up these disputations, right, which is the Christian majority, is that it will demonstrate that Christianity is true, that Judaism is false, and that Jews will convert. Or at the very least, right, it will identify things that they see as problematic within the Jewish faith. So there are two significant disputations that take place in the 13th century. One of them is actually in France, and the other one takes place in Barcelona. So the one takes place in Paris in 1240, and this will have ramifications for Spanish Jewry, as we'll see, and that is a dispute where the Talmud is put on trial, and as a result of these disputations about the Talmud is burned throughout France in the 13th century. Okay? Now you have to appreciate this is before the printing press, right? This is before you can kind of quickly make copies of texts, and you're talking about wagons and wagons and wagons of Talmuds which are gathered together and are burnt in Paris. To a large degree, that marks the end of French Jewry for that time period. Not completely, there'll be further expulsions, but shall we say culturally, that is kind of the nail in the coffin, as it were, of French Jewry in the 13th century. 2 decades later, you have another trial that will take place. This time it will take place in Barcelona, and it will include Nachmanides, Ramban, and there will be debate between Nachmanides and those set up against him over who won the argument. But of course, publicly, the Christians will have won, and they ban the study of Talmud. Okay, and so again, you have this kind of significant moment. It's a significant moment for the Jews living in Aragon, right? These are different kingdoms in Spain, right? In Aragon. And as a result, you see some population shifts. For example, you end up having a rabbi's family from France move to Spain, right? The story of Rabbeinu Asher, who's known as the Rosh, who's a very important halachic authority in the 13th century. He settles and becomes the rabbi of Toledo. And his teachings will become quite influential on the opinions of what is Sephardi halakha, despite the fact that he himself had originated in France. When they will codify halakha, he will be one of the key sources for identifying what was Sephardi halakha. Maybe we'll talk about kind of what that means a little bit later. And then, of course, in following the disputations in Aragon, Ramban leaves. He's forced to flee and will eventually make his way to Jerusalem, right? He'll die in Israel. Again, the end of a kind of a towering religious figure, right, will leave those areas. So these kind of reflect times of growing tension, times of decline within those communities. And why does it begin then? Well, it seems to be related to some degree to the rise of the religious orders within Christianity of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and these communities, right, of religious, figures, right, are part of a growing, almost like religious revival, as it were, happening in the Christian world, right, that's rooted either in ideas of poverty, of self-flagellation, of rigorous debate, right? So this kind of intense religiosity of that time. And it seems that one of the implications of that deep religiosity is, of course, that passion, right, for their faith and the desire to engage with Jews, right, to make them see the truth finally, right, and that kind of results in this tension and elements of decline. It's not where the story ends. The community continues for a very long time, but this is just kind of some of the antecedents that you're starting to see, and some of the, shall we say, fault lines that are emerging within this society, where you have a very noticeable minority community living in an increasingly hostile majority environment. That being said, you're talking about what probably is the largest, most successful, most cultured, most integrated Jewish community in the world at that time, right? So you think, and again, you can't easily compare, centuries and different communities to each other, but you think of, the American Jewish community, right? The largest community, the most integrated, the wealthiest Jewish community in the world, right? Outside of, Israel. And that's what, in a sense, Spanish Jewry was in its time, right? It was the most kind of significant Jewish population. And so they're not just going anywhere, they're not disappearing, but it's complicated. It's complicated, and we'll see that there'll be implications when this community eventually does fall, because it's like the most important Jewish community in the world finally is, disintegrated, and it sends shockwaves through the Jewish world that last for generations. We're not going to get into all of that in this course, but needless to say, it was a seismic shift in the Jewish world. Everything that happens in the Jewish world for the next 200 years after the expulsion, you can relate it back to some degree to the Spanish expulsion. It was a major, major event. Things will carry on, and it's really at the end of the 14th century, so 100 years later, so multiple generations later, that things finally reach a breaking point. What happens in 1391 is there's an archdeacon in Seville, Ferrand Martinez, who is a passionate advocate of converting the Jews, and he will whip up the crowds, right, in the Cathedral of Seville to forcibly convert the Jewish population. And if they refuse to convert, right, to condone their murder. And so what you have beginning in Seville in 1391 is the beginning of a widespread persecution of Jews, almost on, there's this religious leader that's behind it, but almost like, mob type of activity. It spreads like wildfires, and it ends up spreading north through the country, from Seville up to Toledo, up to Barcelona, right throughout the country. This will spread. The end result is that you have masses of numbers of Jews who are killed, and you have masses of Jews who are forcibly converted to Catholicism, okay? Now, this will not even be the end of the story of Spanish Jewry, because again, this is 1391, and 1492 is the expulsion, and so there will also be people who aren't murdered and aren't converted, right? Jewish people who continue to live as Jews. But what this obviously creates is a profound trauma in Spain. In fact, there will even be some Christians who will be persecuted, right? Will be prosecuted for their crimes, right? For their murder of Jewish people, right? So it's not that they all, in a sense, just get off, but so there are kind of lots of stories within the story, as you would expect, of something that happens on a national scale and crosses different kingdoms, right? Iberia is different kingdoms. And the end result, though, of this is that you end up having a very strange set of circumstances, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment, right? But what you'll have is a sizable, still Jewish population. Again, you're talking about the Jewish population was hundreds of thousands of people, so it was quite large. So you'll still have large Jewish populations who will obviously be traumatized by what happened. You'll also, though, and this is significant, have a large population of those who had been converted. Now, even though they had been converted under duress, right? The ruling will be is that the conversions stand. And so even though you're perhaps, according to Christian law, not supposed to forcibly convert someone, but being that they did, well, they did, and now they're Christians, right? And so the expectation will be is that now that they have converted, they are duty-bound to live as Catholics, right? And that will be the expectation. And if they live as Jews, right, that will be considered as a form of heresy, right? Of a quite significant crime. And so, at least publicly, anyone who is converted is now obligated to live a Catholic life. Okay? And so, you may have people living in the same household. Some who had been converted, some who hadn't. Neighbors, relatives, right? Who are sharing, the same streets, right? Maybe working in the same shops, right? Who are now kind of being forced to live different lifestyles. And so you can start to see kind of the complications that are going to come as a result of this. Now, some of those people who've been forcibly converted will take matters into their own hands and will flee, right? And will end up going to places like North Africa, where they will be free to return to live as Jews. Of course, North Africa is Muslim. They won't care that you had been living as Christians, right? And so they go there and they can return to Jewish life. But that is not probably what most people do. They struggle on, right? It's not so easy. It's not like, you just, claim refugee status and move to a new country, right? This is a place where their families have been for generations. The languages they speak, probably their livelihood, their families, right, are still there, right? It's not so easy to just get up and go. And as a result, then there will be a whole kind of complicated internal debate that will take place, let alone the external debate that will take place vis-a-vis Christian views about these Jews or these converted Jews, but there'll also be internal Jewish debates about these converted Jews. The issues internally will relate to questions of identity and halachic implications. And so, for example, according to Jewish law, if a Christian person handles your wine, right, your wine is no longer fit for use, and you have to spill it out, right? That's the stam yenam, right? That's the area of halacha, unless it's mevushal, but that's more of a modern thing, right? So you end up having this question of, obviously there's lots of wine production or grape production in Iberia. So what happens when you get a shipment of either juice or wine to North Africa, and it's been produced by a converted Jew? Now, halachically speaking, technically speaking, you could claim this person is a Jew. They were born a Jew, therefore, perhaps they're Jewish, but they're living as a Catholic. But they don't believe in the Catholicism that they're doing. They're doing because they've been forced to. So what about the juice that they interact with? Is that juice still fit for use for a Jew to drink? Or is it going to be prohibited for a Jew to drink that? So there are, shall we say, these technical points in halakha that will be debated, but fundamentally at the core of these questions will be questions of, are these people Jewish? Are they not Jewish? do we consider them to be believers, or do we consider them to be apostates, right? And what you'll find is over the course of the 15th century, in rabbinic literature that's produced in North Africa, there will be changing attitudes about this population. There's a really wonderful piece of research that was carried out by a professor, Netanyahu, right, who's the father of Prime Minister, right, Netanyahu, right, whose expertise, his area of interest was the Spanish Expulsion. As with anyone who wrote histories, decades ago, there's always different views on, did they, are they only presenting one perspective? Are there other, with any historians from, the 50s and 60s, you're always going to have those debates. So same with him. There's obviously more recent historians discuss his earlier research, but he did a wonderful job of kind of collecting a lot of this material, and he kind of presents these various, kind of moments in that time. And what you find is that in the earliest of the writings about this time, they say these people are Jews, their wine is fit for use, they've been forcibly converted, this is a terrible calamity that's happened, and that's kind of the attitude. But as you kind of move a little bit further over time and you start dealing with, they've had decades to, in theory, leave, right? Then you start having views that say, well, they didn't leave, so therefore these people are what maybe were originally forcibly, were forced to live as Christians. Well, now we're going to consider them as willful Christians, and therefore they may technically be Jews, but they no longer have trustworthiness over their religious scruples, right? And we can't assume that in private they are still maintaining Jewish observance. We have to assume that not only publicly are they living, but privately they're living that way too. And you even start finding some hostile language about them, quoting teachings from Maimonides, about animals eating their own sick, like this idea of just kind of like really seeing them in quite negative light. And then as you move later in the 1400s, you have a shift again that will happen, because then you're talking about not those people, you're talking about their grandchildren. And you say, well, their grandchildren were born into this. They didn't choose to do this, right? They're tinuk shenishpa, right? We consider these to be, babies that were captured and raised this way. And so quite the opposite. We have to do everything we can to embrace them and encourage them to return and lift their spirits, to re-engage with their Jewish identities. And so kind of throughout this time, you have this kind of really, I would say, pained, strained kind of debate going on. Again, you don't find so much of this writing within Spain, because we'll see it's complicated to write about, but certainly from Jewish communities that are interacting with them and perhaps come from Jews who had themselves left during these difficult years, you find a very kind of complicated relationship on how to relate and how to understand these people. What the one key thing is once a Jew, always a Jew. So there is this recognition that technically speaking, they are halakhically Jewish, but in respect to certain things, we treat them as Christians in terms of, their believability on certain areas of testimony and on Jewish matters and things like that, because they say in practice they're living as Christians, right? Even if technically they are Jewish people. Okay. So that is, shall we say, the internal Jewish conflict over this population of people. But you, of course, also have a degree of tension within Christian society as well about what to make of this new reality. And so, for example, you have in Tortosa in 1413 another one of these disputations. It happens with the Yosef Albo, who's a famous Jewish theologian, right? And again, you kind of have this ongoing debates and this desire to say, well, there were these people that we forcibly converted in 1391. Well, now we need to convince the rest to convert too. And at the same time, kind of the flip side of this is this general challenge of how to absorb this converted population, right? The anusim, or the conversos. And you start to, there's one thing when you kind of convert 3 Jews into a population, and you can go ahead, great, good, they kind of mix in. But here all of a sudden, when you're talking about having, significant numbers of people who've been converted, who are, culturally somewhat different, right? Obviously have a different background, right? All of a sudden, you have this weird situation where, ostensibly they share your faith, but they still are different, right? And so you have this problem where this sense of difference beforehand was very clear because, oh, you're a Jew and I'm a Christian. But now it's like you also have this kind of foreign, what's felt as this kind of this foreign or different population, but they're Christians. And so there's a struggle with that. And of course, there's this other element, which is, well, now as Christians, there are no restrictions on their kind of access to participate in society. And so while beforehand, maybe there were some limitations on certain professions, maybe, like the legal professions, or even being part of religious orders, right? Those restrictions fall to the wayside. So all of a sudden you have Jews that are going to then be, their children will become priests, who will become politicians, who will become part of, military, right? Will be kind of become participants in society. And of course, that comes with it perhaps an inherent, kind of sense of kind of upset, because maybe people still just don't like them, or don't trust that they are actually sincere Christians, right? And what you end up having is a decision beginning in Toledo in 1449 is to establish another barometer for assessing whether someone has the right to be full participants in civic life, and that is what they call the purity of blood, right? The limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. And essentially what this sets up, and it will then spread throughout Spain, is that there is a purity test. It's not enough simply to be a Christian. You have to be a pure-blooded Christian. And if your ancestors had been Jews or Muslims, right, you do not have the same status as what we might call an old Christian. And so there becomes this distinction between the new Christians and the old Christians. And so now, even though they've been baptized, even though now maybe they are even sincere Christians, it doesn't matter. They are still barred from becoming full participants in Spanish society because they are the descendants of Jews. As you can expect, this ends up having all kinds of ramifications. It's a bit counterproductive because the best way to ensure that a community doesn't ultimately fully assimilate is to make it impossible for them to ever fully assimilate. And as part of a broader recognition that there are a population of conversos that in fact are perhaps not sincere Christians, or that are, shall we say, complicated Christians, right? That are still maybe observing some Jewish rituals, that are maybe still not full believers, right, in Catholicism. And there is a growing sense that the reason for this is because there are Jews living in Spain, right? And so if you have a two brothers living next door to each other, one which is a Christian, one which is a Jew. So there's a reason that that Christian is not becoming a good Christian, because his brother invites him over for Pesach Seder, right? And when he needs to buy meat, he goes to the local butcher and is buying kosher meat, right? So he's living in a Jewish neighborhood. He's not able to buy, a side of pork, like a good Christian should, right? He's continuing to kind of maintain cultural practices that are associated with having been a Jew. And it's the negative influence of the Jews that is actually preventing these Catholic souls from living good Catholic lives. And so there is a growing tension with this. Now, whether that is shall we say, the sincere animosity towards the Jews, or whether it's part of just this growing attitude of just being anti-Semitic, right, of just simply not wanting Jews around, there is a growing justification, right, a rationale for hostility towards Jewish people, because they are blamed. Oh, we have no problem with Jews. I mean, we think you're heretics, but, there's no pure crime in being a heretic if you've never said you weren't going to be a heretic. It's when you said you'd be a Christian and then you're not a Christian, right? So it's not really the fact that you're Jews that we have a problem with, but it's the fact that you are Jews who are being a bad influence on Christians that makes us really have a problem with you, okay? And so as a result of that, there is a growing tension and some growing efforts to try and limit the potential influence of Jews on these new Christians. And so that will start to impact where they can live, right? Making sure they can't live in the same neighborhoods, or sometimes not even live in the same cities, right? Trying to create distance between those populations. At the same time, what will begin to happen is a growing concern about the sincerity of these conversos, right? Alongside this is, well, are they living good Catholic lives? Are they, observing Christianity, or are they keeping Shabbat? Are they refraining from eating non-kosher meats, right? Are they actually still maintaining a sense of Jewish practice, right? Are they fasting on Yom Kippur, right? What are these people really doing? And so this will lead to the famous institution, which is the Inquisition, right? This is set up by the Dominican, Tomás de Torquemada, in 1482, okay? What's interesting about it is it will be set up independent from Roman authority, right? So it will be independent of Rome and will actually become its own independent body, which will create ultimately conflict between Spain and the Pope, because essentially they're acting independently. It won't be the first time there's ever been an Inquisition, but this Inquisition becomes almost not just for a moment in time like there had been in other centuries. It will become an established institution, right, like a state police, as it were. And in fact, some historians associate the Spanish Inquisition with the modern state, right? The idea that you will have kind of a national kind of body that will be, in a sense, a police force, right? It's kind of something that you don't really have so much in medieval times in that way. Things are done locally. This will become a national body. And its purpose is not to look at what Jews are doing. They know what Jews are doing. Jews are being Jews. It's to look at what Christians are doing. Are Christians being good Christians, or are they being bad Christians, right? Are they still observing Jewish life? Over time, it will also look at, are they witches, or are they Protestants, right? The Inquisition will last for centuries, even into the 1800s, right? And so it will be interested in all kinds of heresies, but its founding heresy is the heresy of Judaism, okay? And it will start setting up tribunals in different cities. It will go to different towns, put posters and say, have you seen any of the following things being done? And it will say, do you see people cleaning their homes on Friday? Right? Have you seen anyone who will not buy rabbit to eat? Have you noticed anybody, blah, 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 right? And you will potentially have servants, neighbors, maybe even family report to the Inquisition authorities that I've seen so-and-so, maybe your business competitor, right? I've seen so-and-so doing these nefarious Jewish things, and they will get pulled in front of the Inquisition. Now, they will, I don't know if we have time to kind of go into all of the elements of the activities of the Inquisition, but it is a rigorous, tribunal in the sense that it will document a person's genealogy because, of course, they want to know, are you a new Christian or are you an old Christian, right? Who are you related to? Maybe they need to look into your relatives. Maybe there is a case that happened 2 years ago involving your uncle, and that would be really interesting if now you are being accused of that, right? Because they will start to try to figure out networks and connections. And, oh, interesting, you used to live in Seville and now you live in, Toledo. Well, we're going to write to the authorities in Seville and see whether they have any documentation on you, perhaps from some earlier time. And so it's kind of this extensive kind of network of things that they do. And you typically have two options. You can confess, or you can, right? You can be negativo, right? You can deny the charges. Now, if you confess, and it's your first time being accused, then they will take all of your property, but you will be spared, okay? You may have to wear the sambanito, right? This clothing that identifies that you had been, right, a bad Christian, right? You may have seen images of it, or that's right, this kind of cloak with the red X over it, right, with the dunce cap. And you may have to walk out in front of a public parade, the auto de fe, right, of the people who have, been found to have been wrong, but you've confessed. Now, if it's your second time, if you're a relapsed confessor, then you can be burnt at the stake. Or perhaps you deny the charges, they don't accept your denial, they can also burn you at the stake, okay? So it becomes very difficult, right, to kind of think about how am I going to play this, because you could deny, and they could subject you to 10 years of torture, right, could last years, and maybe they don't actually have any hard proof. And so then ultimately you can be let off. But you have to be willing, you don't never know what they know, right? You don't know who their witnesses are, right? You don't know what case they actually have, right? It's all done with secrecy. There's no, the way we think of in modern courts where you have to put your evidence forward so that the defense knows what evidence you have. It's all done in secret. You don't know, you're locked up underground, and you have to kind of make a judgment of how are you going to play it. It obviously creates a huge amount of fear, distrust, obviously public burnings of people. It's a very obviously terrible institution, and again, it lasts for centuries. But presumably they were right, meaning there were people who were supposed to be the good Catholics as far as they were concerned that were practicing Judaism, which as far as they were concerned was heresy. So there's a debate among historians over whether the Inquisition's activities were simply trumped up charges in order to extort the money from wealthy people, right? They just wanted to get the money, because then who got to keep the money? The Inquisition, right? So Inquisition became fabulously wealthy, right? So were they just kind of making up charges in order to get the money from new Christians over the generations? Or was it actually this like really sincere religious thing, which we might look at and say was awful? I mean, you forcibly convert these people, then you prosecute them for not believing. I mean, you can look at it in this really terrible way, but maybe from their perspective as Catholics, well, but you were converted, you should be a good Catholic. So, and they're saving your soul. So, obviously you can look at it different ways, and probably, there's a mixture of everything, especially when we're talking about an institution that lasted for centuries. But what ultimately happens is a few things. There is a sense that it's an ongoing problem, right? I mean, they're trying to root it out, but obviously they don't believe they're being fully successful. And this will start to lay the groundwork for the expulsion, okay? Because at this point, when there's an Inquisition, there are Jews and there are new Christians living in Spain. It'll be in 1492 that all the Jews will be expelled. Of course, all the new Christians will be forced to stay, right? And at that point forward, you'll still have an Inquisition, but now you'll only have new Christians, right? There won't be any Jews anymore that are part of that story. And there are different kind of theories around why the expulsion happens in 1492. Of course, shall we say, historically, it's a significant year because that's the year that the Reconquista is completed, right? So there is a sense that they have just succeeded in expelling the last Islamic, authority in Spain. It is now a Christian country. That may have played a role with saying, well, we've gotten rid of the Muslims, now we should get rid of the Jews, right? This should be a purely Christian country, right? They refer to, the very Christian, right, monarchs, right? Ferdinand and Isabella, right? They unify, right? They marry, they unify the kingdom, right? So there could be some element of that. There had been expulsions in France. Obviously in England there had been expulsions, right? So it could just be, it's just making its way from England to France and now down to Spain, right? The idea of expelling your Jewish population. It could simply be anti-Semitism. They just don't want their Jews there, right? Or it could be related to the converso question. What's interesting is we have the Edict of Expulsion, and it gives its rationale for the expulsion. So I'm going to read to you a bit of the Edict of Expulsion, okay? Now, I'll leave it to you to decide whether what they're saying is the reason or whether this is kind of what they've convinced themselves. But it says the following. It says, "You know well, or ought to know, that whereas we have been informed that in these our kingdoms there were some wicked Christians who Judaized," right, who were, right, the conversos, they were practicing Judaism, "and apostatized from our holy Catholic faith, the great cause of which was interaction between Jews and these Christians. In the courts which we held in the city of Toledo in the past year of 1480, we ordered the separation of the said Jews in all cities, towns, and villages of our kingdoms and lordships, and commanded that they be given Jewish quarters and separate places where they should live, hoping that by their separation, the situation would remedy itself." So they said in 1480, we made the decision to segregate Jews from new Christians. Furthermore, we procured and gave orders that inquisition should be made, right, in 1481, right, in our aforementioned kingships and lordships, which, as you know, has for 12 years, right, from 1481 to 1492, has been made and is being made, and by many guilty persons have been discovered, as is very well known. And accordingly, we are informed by the inquisitors and by other devout persons, ecclesiastical and secular, that great injury has resulted and still results since the Christians have engaged and continue to engage in social interaction and communication. They have had means and ways they can to subvert and to steal faithful Christians from our holy Catholic faith and to separate them from it, right? So what they're saying is that there is still attempts by these Jews to try to get these converted ones, right, their descendants, to come back to the Jewish faith. And to draw them to themselves and subvert them to their own wicked belief and conviction, instructing them in the ceremonies and observances of their law, holding meetings at which they read and teach that which people must hold and believe according to their law, achieving that the Christians and their children be circumcised, and giving them books from which they may read their prayers, and declaring to them the fasts that they must keep, and joining with them to read and teach them the history of their law, indicating to them the festivals before they occur, advising them of what in them they are to hold and observe, carrying to them and giving to them from their houses unleavened bread and meats ritually slaughtered, instructing them about the things from which they must refrain, as much in eating as in other things, in order to observe their law, and persuading them as much as they can to hold and observe the law of Moses, convincing them that there is no other law or truth except for that one. This proved by many statements and confessions, both from these same Jews and from those who have been perverted and enticed by them, which has rebounded to the great injury, detriment, and opprobrium of our holy Catholic faith. And so here they lay out what, in their view, is a damning account of the persistent Jewish community and its impact on their new Christian population. Okay? As a result of this, they say, again, they talk about how they tried to separate these populations into different cities, different regions, finding that it's not been effective. And so they continue and they say, therefore we, with the counsel and advice of prelates, great noblemen of our kingdoms, and other persons of learning and wisdom of our council, having taken deliberation about this matter, resolve to order the said Jews and Jewesses of our kingdom to depart and never to return. And it sets out that this must occur by the end of July 1492, right, which essentially lands on Tisha B'Av, right, maybe a day or two off, right, and this is signed by the monarchs. And so here you have their rationale. It's interesting, it's a very long document. They clearly were interested to show that this was, something that they had justification for, that there was rationale for it, that had the buy-in of, all the lords and magistrates. I mean, it's a robust document. Now, when people leave, they're not allowed to take their property with them. So were they sincerely trying to stop influence on Christians, or were they just trying to get Jewish property? I don't know. I'll leave that. It's not, we have what they have said. We know what the impact of their decisions are. What perhaps was really behind it, well, I'm sure we all have different views about what maybe was really going on. But ultimately, in practice, regardless of all of it, it does mean that in 1492, the Jewish community of Spain, after centuries, was no more. That ended Jewish life in Spain. And incidentally, in Inquisition records, because the records survive, really from about 1515, you no longer find cases trying people for Jewish practice in Spain. So it seems that at the very least it was effective, right? Because after that time, there's cases, like I said, about witchcraft and and other things, but the crime of Judaism ends in Spain, right? They seem to have successfully snuffed out any vestiges of Jewish life among its new Christian population. And so, looking at this period, particularly from 1391 to 1492, is obviously a very kind of dark, story. It's a time of where there's massacres and forced conversions, ultimately persecutions of those who had been converted, ongoing persecutions then of Jews, forcing people to to move, to live in new areas, to not interact with one another, limiting what professions people could do, and ultimately expulsion. I mean, in that sense, this is amongst this, there are people like Abravanels and, great rabbinic figures, and so, it's like the complexity of Jewish life, where you still have, some remarkable Jewish achievements and religious achievements, at the same time dealing with, incredibly difficult and challenging times as well. This will, of course, as I mentioned at the outset, send Spanish Jewry, out. They'll end up in North Africa again, some, more going to North Africa, people ending up in Italy, eventually over to the Ottoman Empire. And there'll be whole stories, right? What happens to those populations, right? The Eastern Sephardim, right? The Sephardim who end up in North Africa, right? Their impact. What happens when they arrive in those places? What kind of influence will they have on, right, the Jewish populations that already live there? They will far outnumber the Jewish populations of the places they arrive. You will have tens of thousands, some people say hundreds of thousands, of Spanish Jews that will end up scattering across the Jewish world, across the Mediterranean, right? You'll even have Ashkenazi Jews in Poland 2 centuries later who have traditions that their ancestors were actually the Sephardi Jews that made their way up into the Polish kingdom. It's beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but that will be this kind of beginning of this kind of mass Sephardi diaspora and exodus from Spain. But as we'll see next week, there's another place that the Sephardim escape to, and that's Portugal. And that will be the story of the Western Sephardim, which we'll begin to look at next week. And so this is the great epic, of challenging time, but of kind of the end of Sephardi Jewry. But as we know, the story doesn't end. Sephardi move on to new places. They retain culture. They speak Ladino, right? There is kind of an ongoing connection to their Sephardic heritage, halachic heritage, but of course, lots of implications for their life, kind of figuring it out. We know of great suffering of these immigrants, we have stories, people getting places and, basically starving to death, trying to eat grass, maybe being turned away from where they go to, being forced to go back to Spain and adopt Catholicism simply because they have no place else to go. It's a very difficult few decades. And as I said, you see implications that last for generations as a result of this. I mean, even the Shabtai Tzvi affair in the 17th century, you can see how it relates back to the expulsion. So it's a tsunami of the Jewish world that is hard to kind of compare it other to then. And again, it's not the same event and it's different, but you think of kind of the impact of the Holocaust, right? Talking about like a massive, which at that point was the largest Jewish population in the world, and kind of the reverberations that we still experience today from that is kind of, for the Jewish world at that time, what that event would have experienced for them. But one of the things I'll mention that I had kind of referenced earlier, and it relates to what you said about the fact that Spain had been different kingdoms, is that when Jews leave Spain and go to Salonika, right, and end up in the East, originally they get there, they're not going as a single community. You'll have the synagogue of the Catalonian Jews. You'll have the synagogue of the Castilian Jews. You'll have the Portuguese Jews, right? They will be seen as different communities. They speak different languages, right? They come from Iberia. They have a sense of a shared, but they are different communities. And it takes about 100 years until they merge largely into one community. Not entirely, but largely into one community. Part of the key process will be people like Rav Yosef Karo, publishing the Shulchan Aruch, which will be an attempt to amalgamate these different traditions and to present as what is the Sephardi halacha. But it took a long time for his work to be adopted by Sephardim because there was a lot of debate around it. Because one of the things he does is says, I'm going to take the majority view between Rambam, Rif, and Rash, and then based on that I will determine what is the Sephardi view. But those are three different people who lived in different places who each had their own different backgrounds, and he's kind of coming up with this formula of, majority rules. And people say, it's very nice that you think majority rules, but I come from a region where we followed the views of the Rash. So why are we going to follow another view just because that's what Rambam and Rif believed? Our tradition is to follow the Rash. Or people say, well, we followed the Rambam, so why are we going to follow a different view? So it took a long time for those communities to become one community. But obviously over time it largely happens. But what you're saying is true, that it reflects that Spanish Jewry was not one community. It was many communities. And again, it kind of, I think, underscores the trauma of what they went through, that they kind of go through this terrible thing and then are kind of all thrown together. There's this kind of process of homogenization, much like has happened after the Holocaust, right? You have different Jewish communities, Jews from Lithuania and Poland and Germany and, Romania and Ukraine and Russia, and all of a sudden, they're all living on the same, street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and they've got to figure out how to, what prayer do they say on Shabbat? Because they all have a different tradition about what to say. So it takes time, right, until there's this larger homogenization, right? Till the result is that today we think of kind of Sephardi Jewry and Ashkenazi Jewry, almost as if they're like two communities, when if you would have gone back 100 years ago in Europe or 500 years ago in Spain, you would have been talking about places that were really different from one another. And we've lost that diversity because you've had, calamity and persecution and, populations being forced to move and then live amongst each other, and that has created tension along the way. But ultimately, people then eventually find a way to kind of have a new standard for what is kind of the way that they do things.
And it's also the accents.
Next time we're going to be looking at the continuing story of the Western Sephardim. So we'll leave the Jews who went to the east for another time, and we will look to the Jews who went to the west, to Portugal, to see that next stage in their story.